Due Thursday, yeah. That is,
Thursday before midnight too?
yeah, before, same thing.
Let's do
midnight.
Thursday before midnight.
Yeah, okay, folks.
Okay, so
Let's leave that, yeah, okay. I mean, if I say any more, I'll confuse you.
Well, that's okay. Then I won't say.
And if I say any more, I'll confuse you, but I mean, it's on the syllabus, and you might know, but now I try to stick to the syllabus.
Right.
And also, I try hard to announce the test.
Yes.
But every once in a while, somebody come in who did not know that there was a test there. And it's not, it's because they were absent and didn't check. All right, yeah. It's not because I did not announce it. And I am missing my marker. Well, I can live with that. I'll just pull out another one. All right. I don't know where that thing got off to, but maybe to turn up later. Wait. All right, so much for that. All right. Now, these places in this part of the world would have remained impoverished. All right. As important as the Middle East is right now, the Middle East now makes news every day. But folk, for more than 100 years, there was almost nothing said about the Middle East. I have a history book at home. It's a history of the United States since 1900. It's entitled since 1900. It was written in 1969. In 1969, I took a course called Recent American History. You find almost nothing about the Arabs in that book. Nothing about the Arab world. It just was not important to us. And we overlooked it. But today, it's different. One thing that put that world on the map was the discovery of oil. Oil was discovered at one point in Arabia. Oil was discovered in Iran. Oil was discovered in Iraq. And oil was discovered a few other places in this part of the region of the world. In the case of Arabia, Arabia was united under a man named Saud, and it's called Saudi Arabia today. Saudi Arabia is the only country today that is named after its ruling family. It's always been called Arabia, but today it's called Saudi Arabia. The only way they made a lot of money, because it's mostly desert, so they made money from Muslim pilgrims who had come there on a pilgrimage. And one of the rules of Muslims is, if possible, Muhammad said that Islamic people should go to Arabia at least once in their lifetime. And a lot of them do manage to go to Arabia once in their lifetime, and sometimes they have stampedes and kill hundreds of them, gathering around the Kaaba. But they've managed to control that somewhat in recent years. But when oil was discovered, Arabia became wealthy. These other countries, the same thing. Now, while this was going on, while Iran and Iraq were being ruled in part by the British and the French, the Jews slowly trickled into Palestine, a lot of them determined, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism going on. As one of you pointed out, Walt Disney was anti-Semitic, and I did not mention now, Adolf Hitler was extremely anti-Semitic. By the way, that article in the in Time magazine that named Hitler Man of the Year, they finally had a little bit about his anti-Semitism somewhere on page 43 of the magazine or something like that. Buried way back deep in the magazine, they had a little bit that he was a racist and he was an anti-Semite, but then again, a lot of people were that in those days, so it didn't matter so much. But the Jews were trickling into Palestine, and the Arabs strongly resented it. The Jews, folk, they only moved into land that was not being used. And let me say this. I bought a house 19 years ago on a piece of property that was vacant. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, the house was vacant, so the realtor showed us, and we liked it. My wife and I liked it. We moved in. We're still living there. Before that, I bought another house that was vacant. Okay. Nothing wrong with that. The Jews moved in on land that the Arabs were not using. The land was a barren desert wasteland until the Jews moved in, and they transformed it into a really fertile, highly productive farmland. In some cases, taking the dirt one bucket at a time and washing the alkaline out of the dirt. Pick up a bucket of dirt, wash the alkaline off, throw the alkaline into the river, put the dirt back into the soil, and one bucket at a time makes the land productive. As somebody has said, as only they can do. The Arabs were not necessarily good farmers. They were desert people, camel drivers, herds people, but not necessarily growers of crops. The Arabs tried to restrict Jewish immigration. The result is for a later chapter. You might know in 1948, after the Holocaust, Israel became a nation. All right, moving on from the Middle East to Asia and Africa. The non-Western intellectuals, the Far East intellectuals, do not see Marxism as relevant. Now that is, all right, the reason your book brings it up in its first paragraph is, today the biggest country in the Far East is China, and it's a Marxist country. Now, Karl Marx never believed that Russia would become the first communist country. He never believed that China would become communist. But communism seemed to them, the Marxist kind of communism, seemed to the intellectuals in China to be too anti-religious and too anti-capitalist. And they said communism is not relevant to us. They said that according to Marx, communism had to come from capitalism, and your African and Asian nations were not capitalistic. But then came the Russian Revolution of 1917, and these nations began to study Marxism seriously, and they began to embrace the idea of communism. Lenin sent persons to Asian countries and African nations to convince them that Marxism would be better. Now, the story is told that when President Woodrow Wilson went to France, he was met by a Vietnamese bellboy. This Vietnamese bellboy tried to convince Mr. Wilson, hey, Mr. will you please help us get our independence from France? Wilson paid him no attention. This Vietnamese bellboy turned out to be Ho Chi Minh. And my generation suffered terribly as a result of Wilson's snub. So Ho Chi Minh then turned to Lenin, and Lenin listened to him. Wilson would not. Lenin did. Ho Chi Minh became a communist, and he became our adversary. And really, if Woodrow Wilson would not have had such a low opinion, but Woodrow Wilson was a racist. Also, by our standards of today, he was a sexist. Wilson did not believe that these peoples could manage themselves, so he would not listen to Ho Chi Minh. Hindsight has 20/20 vision. Anyway, to make a long story short, eventually communism was to take over China. Eventually communism was to take over Vietnam. And a lot of African nations were to start to embrace it, particularly Angola and Ethiopia. But finally, though, communism became old hat to some of these countries. But for a time, they were willing to experiment with, talk about, and embrace the possibility of communists. A lot of communists were trained in Moscow and then sent back to their native lands. In other words, some Chinese person would go to Moscow to learn communism, then go back to China to set up a communist country there. The Vietnamese were sent to Moscow to learn communism also. And the communists tried to make headwards into Angola and the Congo, which they did. Now, a lot of your Muslim countries did not go communist for one reason. One big reason. And that is the communists deny that there's a God, and Muslims are firmly convinced there is one. And this has kept a lot of your Muslim countries from going communist. Otherwise, they're alike in that both believe in control and strongly try to control. All right. Which brings us to China. When we last talked about China, Sun Yat-sen overthrew the last emperor and set himself up as in charge, but then he was forced to relinquish and turn it over to a military dictator. Sun Yat-sen had to flee. Now, there was another one who I'm not going to mention. Well, I'll mention his name, a man named Yuan, but he's not important to us today. The one who is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek took over after Yuan died. He took over, and however, the problem was, and this is the problem that Chinese have had all down through the ages, a lot of men who followed him were corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek tried to use Confucianism to modernize China, but the Chinese were steeped in tradition. A lot of Chinese became disillusioned with Confucius, owing to the fact they said, well, if Confucianism is so great, how come we lag behind the rest of the world? How come that Europe, Western Europe, and the United States have it better than we do? And they became disillusioned with Confucianism. So into this scenario, another man, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a communist, but he and Chiang Kai-shek fought it out. Chiang Kai-shek tried to have Mao Zedong killed. He didn't. But they fought to a standstill for several decades. Now, eventually, hopefully all of you know that Mao won and China became a communist country and has remained so to this day. Chiang Kai-shek, though, promised, and this is something that all dictators promise, all right, I know I'm dictatorial now, but I promise once you people are ready, I'll give you democracy. Once you're ready for it, Latin American dictators do the same thing. But then war intervened. Japan invaded China. It was a mistake on the part of the Japanese because China had too many people, and the United States sent a lot of fighting equipment, heavy artillery and machine guns and things like that to help the Chinese fight the Japanese. And Japan had extended itself too far and simply could not handle the part of the world they conquered. Well, the world went into a big depression, as we've talked about, in the 1930s. And China was as depressed, well, I'll put it this way. My dad remembered the Depression. I asked my mother about the Depression one time, and she said, well, we hardly knew there was a Depression. They're really, really poor people. To them, what was the Depression? I mean, they weren't any poorer than they were before, so the Depression did not affect them so much. But for my mother, her father was a poor dirt farmer, and again, lived off his farm. Hardly realized there was a Depression. This was southern Kentucky for you now. But the rest of the world was having a depression. The Chinese, they were already in poverty anyway, so again, but the rest of the world could not really help China because they were depressed also. China did not industrialize. Chiang Kai-shek spent what money China had on the military. He feared two things, Japan and communism. Japan and communism, and both invaded. He was able to defeat Japan, but he could not defeat communism. The literature of the period, and this is, folks, now this is important. The Chinese intellectuals put out literature that talked bad about China's past. Do you see anything like that going on in America right now? In other words, run America to the ground, make America look evil, talk about how racist America was, and some of that's true, yes. Therefore, down with America. Well, the intellectuals of China did the same thing. And talked about how bad China's past was. All this was to lead to a communist takeover of China. And when they did, 25 million Chinese starved to death. Just like it happened in Russia. I mean, I once asked a class, what worldview has led to the deaths of tens of millions of people in the 20th century? Several of them knew. The worldview is communism. It starves a lot of its people to death until they modify it a little bit with a little bit of capitalism. All right.
Wait,
Yes.
so 25 million Chinese starved because,
For the same reason, it wasn't that the crops were bad. It was simply the central government could not redistribute. I mean, keep in mind, China was not only big, but it was very densely populated. And they're right, the farmers would produce the crops and turn the crops in like they were supposed to and expect to get what they needed back. Instead, they starved to death.
That's
From each, go ahead.
That is true. Based on my grandma's true experiences, because my grandma in 1960s, he lived in Shanghai, and she had several relatives lived as peasants, lived in countryside, and then one day all of them just go to my grandma's house, and my grandma asked them what happened, and they said, okay, that's what happened. Our neighbor, he's a single woman with five or six children, and they all died because they have nothing to eat.
Well, see, 1949 was the year of the communist war. That's the same year I was born, 1949. And I was thinking, what if I had been born in China? My life would have certainly been, I'd probably joined the Red Guard. And today's, I understand the Chinese look on the Red Guard as the waste generation. Maybe you feel differently. The Red Guard was my generation. Grew up, and instead of learning a trade, they went around destroying things, killing people, and promoting male.
Oh, about the Red Guard, I have a classmate, and he told me he used to have something very valuable, but I don't know. I think it's a coin. It's a kind of coin. It's a coin.
The coin.
Asian coin is it's valuable. And one day the Red Guard just go to their house, take the coin from his grandma.
Yeah, well, that's what they did. The Red Guard would go to, they were my generation, my age. They would go in and take anything they want, and there was no law. And even Mayo admitted, my Red Guards are more destructive than they are helpful. But even Mayo finally admitted that, but he was the one who turned it loose. Go around and help make everybody communistic. But anyway, I would read about it when I was younger. Read about thinking, this would be me if I were over there. I want to say this, folk, about seeing only the bad in people. Some years back, more than 34 years ago, I dated a girl who I later learned was alcoholic and suicidal. She's still around. If you were to meet her and tell her that John Cunningham is my teacher, she could tell you all kinds of bad stuff about me, and some of it would be true, and some of it might contain truth, and some of it would be pure garbage. She's now 67 years old, never been married, no children. All she could see in me and other men was the bad, the evil. She once told me, I think all men are slobs. She did. She was an attractive woman. Point I'm making is, the more evil they are, the more evil they'll see in other people without seeing the good. All right, I'll leave that for now. All right, Japan. In the early part of the 1900s, Japan seemed to be on its way developing democracy, but they didn't. They became more and more democratic, more and more autocratic as time went on. Now, folk, this is something that'll confuse you about history. Today, Japan's population is aging. They're not having that many babies. But in between the wars, their population grew really rapidly between World War I and World War II. During World War I, Japan fought on our side. They were not our enemy. But Japan had a big population. They were producing a lot. They needed markets for their produce. So they got the idea that what we can do, I mean, they said, we're the best people in the Far East. We're going to conquer every nation in the Far East and set up an empire called the Empire of the Rising Sun. And they were going to conquer China, conquer Vietnam, conquer the Philippines, and even conquer Australia, and conquer India. You know, where they didn't have enough people to do that, folks. They spread themselves too thin, like Hitler did. But they were going to conquer the Far East, and then they were going to make colonies out of China and India, and both these countries had a bigger population than they did. Australia, and they were going to make colonies in countries and force these countries to give them the raw materials, and the Japanese factory workers would transform these raw materials into finished products and sell it back to these nations. The plan did not work because, for one thing, they're wanting to take over the Philippines, brought them into conflict with the United States, who owned the Philippines at the time. Australia was owned by Britain, as was India, so that brought them into conflict with Britain. And they just didn't have the means to control a country like China or India. India both outpopulated them, as did China. They also were at odds with Russia, and Russia had a bigger population. So some of their enemies were the United States, Russia, China, and India. All four of them had more people than they did. So pick the winner. Japan went to war, as we know. But anyway, they wanted to get markets for their products. They found out after the war they could sell their products without conquering people. And after the war, they started selling their products to the United States galore. At first, it was just cheap toys and cameras. Then they started selling transistor radios, then motorcycles, then automobiles, then airplanes, then computers, things like that, stereos. But their products got better and better as time went on. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Anyway, when the Depression hit, it hit the Japanese really hard. Unlike the Chinese, who hardly knew there was depression in Japan, when depression hit, the autocratic people took over. The democratic people were set aside because the depression was blamed on democracy. So autocrats took over Japan, and the autocrats remained in power until the end of World War II. The leader was Tojo. The emperor was nothing more than a figurehead, as he has been down throughout most of Japan's history. All right, Latin America. Latin America was mostly autocratic, but like Turkey, on paper they would claim they were democracies, but they actually were autocratic. Now, Venezuela, your book mentions that, they had a dictatorship. The United States was really unpopular because the United States would look after its own interest and move in. I know I told this class how that I always think of Latin America when I remember this incident, but when I was 18, two of my sisters, aged 10 and 8, got into a fight, and I thought I'd intervene on behalf of the young one who was being beaten up by the 10-year-old. And the next thing I know, both of the girls were pounding on me. Well, hey, what does that have to do with Latin America? Everything. The United States has everything. We've made enemies of all sides. We'd intervene on one side thinking we're helping ourselves and helping them too. And the next thing we know, we knew both sides were pounding on us. Yeah. Oh yes. Anyway, so you men, if you have little sisters, let the two of them fight it out, which I should have done. The Depression hit, and exports from Latin America dropped because Americans could the United States no longer afford Latin American products. And the Latin Americans suffered from the Depression. Now, I want to say this about Latin America.
Excuse me, sir, are you
Yes.
still in chapter 24? You're in 25?
I'm just about to start chapter 25, just
Okay.
about. Latin America is the last thing I cover. Anyway, during the war that we're going to talk about next, Latin America joined with the United States. Yes. They waited till the war was almost over. Almost over, and then they piled on, you might say. If you've seen a football player who, when he sees the running back is down, he'll just pile on to try to make it look good. There's a penalty for that, 15 yards if the official catches you. But basically, the Latin American countries all declared war against Germany once the war was over and decided anyway, and a lot of them did not do any fighting. I had an Argentinian boy brag about how much his country contributed. No fighting, no actual battle. They just contributed by sending their goods to help fight the Germans. But otherwise, now, the next point I want to make about Latin America, this is somewhat sinister. When the war ended, a lot of Nazis fled to Latin America. And recently there was a movie put out about Adolf Eichmann. My wife and I watched it, and I'm thinking about watching it again, about Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was caught in Argentina and brought to Israel for trial. In the meantime, Josef Mengele went to Paraguay, but he was never caught because Israel did not want to lose Latin America's vote in the United Nations. In the United Nations, Latin America tended to vote for Israel. Don't ask me why. But a lot of Nazis, and there's a rumor going around that Adolf Hitler himself escaped and went to Latin America. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Hitler lived until about 1955. He lived 10 years after the war and finally died, I believe, in Mexico or someplace in Latin America. But Latin America actually was playing both sides of the fence in the war. They were really pro-German, but they did not want to fight with Germany if Germany lost, and they wound up joining sides with the United States because it was obvious the United States would win. Then they started harboring the Nazis who could escape and come to them. Now, with all respect now, a lot of Nazis found their way to the United States. So that's another topic. All right.